Welcome this morning. Great to have you with us. And we have an event today which is called Transforming Conflict Cultures in the Workplace. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional custodians of Australia and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. We recognise the continuing connection to lands, waters and the community. International Mediation Awareness Week was created to showcase mediation taking place across the world. And the Mediator Network team has set out to encourage more engagement with this form of dispute resolution by using this week and activities throughout the year to promote mediation at an international and regional level. We are working with a growing number of organisations and individuals to bring you International Mediation Awareness Week and are delighted that we are joined by some of the most amazing and passionate individuals who will help make this a success. The week is brought to you and managed by a Mediation Network in collaboration with our global partners and regional coordinators. My name's Craig Anderson. It's my pleasure to host today, and your session will be beginning shortly with our speaker. Our sessions are being recorded, so please turn off your camera and audio, and later there'll be a question and answer session at the end. So please put your questions in the chat box and I will pick up those for the speaker. If you happen to drop out, please log in again and I'll make sure that I let you back in to the session. I'm delighted to introduce to you our guest speaker today for this keynote, and that is Anna Faoagali. And Anna is a director of Enverio Workplace Solutions and is really making a big difference in the industry in doing mediations. And she has a lot of experience in this area. And Australia really is the most regulated workplace environment. Now, our workplaces are subject to Commonwealth, state and local laws, which are administered by various jurisdictions from the Commonwealth Ombudsman's offices, state Ombudsman's offices, Fair Work Commission, Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission, Health and Safety Officers, Industry Ombudsmans, and Crime and Misconduct Commissions, ASIC regulations, just to name a few. Well, you're probably tired and confused already, right? But many companies promote courses on how to have difficult conversations. We have a very sophisticated and complex complaints culture. However, we're not so great at receiving those complaints, especially if they're about us. In this session, Anna will be speaking about the techniques that we use in mediation to assist our participants to receive feedback in a useful and safe way that promotes their workplace relationship before mediation, at mediation, and post-mediation. So it's my pleasure now to hand over to Anna. Thanks for being with us this morning, Anna.
Thank you, Craig. Thanks, Joanne, for coordinating the event. It's great to see so many people who are interested in how we use mediation in workplaces. The first thing I'd like to do is to invite you all to share with me where you're from. I'm interested in where you're from. Are you from Australia? Are you mediators yourself? Are you employers looking for some ideas about how to manage conflict? That will really help me to make sure that you get something of value out of today's session. So please, in the chat box, if you can just share where you're from and why you registered into this session so I can make it as relevant as possible for you. I have a little bit of a speckled heritage. So my father was born in Samoa. My mother's a New Zealander. I grew up in Samoa, New Zealand and Australia. I've worked in Hong Kong and PNG. I'm very LGBTQ friendly, and I really enjoy being part of an inclusive and diverse mindset. So welcome to you all. I can see Australian mediator, Australian mediator, Australian mediator. Okay, great. So I'm going to just say target and business owners, great, coach, FDRP. Okay, well, I'm really going to target this for mediators. So people who have an understanding of mediation and have some basic frameworks that they work from already. If you have any questions, then that's totally fine. As Craig said, put them in the chat box and we'll try and address them. Envario is actually federal. So we have contractors and consultants all over Australia. And what we specifically do is workplace mediations, workplace investigations. We partner with companies to receive and process internal complaints on their behalf. And we are a team of mediators, investigators, conflict coaches, and complaints consultants. So, workplace mediation is a key intervention that we use to improve workplace relationships and in turn, workplace cultures. The model that we use has an over 80% success rate. And what I mean by a success rate is when we call them back, that the parties are still working together and their relationship has improved. Okay, and so we're really, really proud of that. So are we able to get the PowerPoint up, Craig, by any chance? And if we could just flick to slide 3, that would be great. I'm just going to adjust my screen, everybody. And I'm just looking at, oh, we got someone in Los Angeles, Texas. How exciting. That's exciting. Okay, so I just want to take you through the definition of what we use when we're defining workplace culture. And the definition that I'm using for workplace culture is that it's a collection of shared values, shared expectations and practices and behaviours that guide and inform the actions of all team members. So, you know, workplace culture is directly impacted by the quality of the conversations that staff are having. So when we're looking at transforming conflict cultures, it really requires that we pay attention to those conversations and behaviours and build some scaffolding in around those conversations so that people can have them in a safe way. As Craig said in the introduction, Australia is a really complex complaint environment. So we're really well trained in complaining, but we're not so great at resolving them. Okay, so when I talk about scaffolding a conversation, what I mean is like breaking down the conflict and putting structure around it so it can be articulated and heard differently. For example, anyone who works in businesses will know this conversation is, you know, when you're working with managers and you're working with HR, they might think that the problem at hand is really not that big. And they might say, well, in Australia, it's very common to say, just go and sort it out, you know, drink some cement, harden up, that type of thing, right? So it's not useful in terms of progressing their skills and being able to resolve the conflict over time. But the problem is that a lot of us aren't trained in being able to do that. So we don't put scaffolding around how they actually do that. We just have an expectation that they can do that. They can resolve those, what we call lower level conflict matters. So they're matters that don't breach a policy or procedure, but they're still causing an enormous amount of upset to the culture, to the workplace environment, often referred to as very toxic, that type of thing. So scaffolding a conversation, mediation is really good to scaffold a conversation to give people tools around how they actually do that in a way that is constructive and it isn't going to get themselves or their employers into any escalating trouble, given all of the third-party bodies that are out there ready to take that complaint. For those of you, I'm just reading what other people have put there. So you're aware of, you know, the Fair Work Act and how that is used. People can just call up the Fair Work Commission and lodge a bullying complaint. They don't even have to raise that with their employer. Right, so mediations are becoming increasingly more used as a mechanism to try and address and de-escalate these types of conflict, this type of conflict. So that's what we really do, is we really work with businesses to improve the way that their people respond to receiving feedback, given we're so good at giving feedback. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? All right. I might get you to flick to the next slide, Craig. And we've done that one, and the next one. And the next one. Okay, let's stop here. So these are some of the characteristics that we see in a toxic workplace culture. So Craig, that might be slide 5, I think. Yeah, perfect. So if we just sort of sit here for a little bit. So a toxic complaints culture in workplaces that we see are those that impact a significant number of people in the workplace, and or a significant number of people are complaining, and the complaints are persistent. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has a problem with everyone or their ecosystem that they're working in. It might just be 1 or 2 people, but their problem starts to leak out to the rest of the team. We see that really frequently. Another characteristic of toxic complaints cultures includes agreement armies. That's what I call them. You might have other words to use to describe them, but that's when workplaces don't really have a lot of skill in being able to contain complaints. So instead of going directly to the person and addressing the complaint, the person will go to other people within the organization and try and get their agreement around what their problem is without actually engaging in a process to be able to resolve it directly between themselves and whoever they have a problem with. Another characteristic we see all the time in toxic complaint cultures is that each side is victimized. See that a lot in really toxic workplaces. So when I'm doing intakes with people, they always are, both of them will say that they've been, they're the victim of whatever incident has occurred. There's lots of blame going on, so there's not really a focus on how to resolve it. And in fact, often when I'm speaking to individuals about what happened and I ask them, what would you like to resolve it? 80% of the time, they haven't really put their mind to it. Not only have they not put their mind to it, but they haven't really been asked that throughout the whole process. And the last few things, these are some of the conversations that we hear where there are really toxic complaints culture, that there's no confidence that anything will be done about it. That's a really common one where everybody, it doesn't matter if they complain. It doesn't matter if they raise concerns. Nothing's ever going to get done about it. And that's a real leadership situation. And this one here, that there's not capacity to provide feedback because there's fear that that person won't be able to accept that feedback in a reasonable way. So even if they were to say, hey, I really don't like it when you interrupt me in meetings, the fear that people have around bringing that up might be something like, oh, I don't know how they'll take that, or they'll get angry, or variations of that theme. There's a real avoidance to reach resolution. They're kind of hooked on complaining, and when you're trying to shift that culture, we see that a lot. Obfuscation and redirection. So that's when they can't actually, they don't have the skills, or they don't want to actually isolate what the actual problem is. And you'll see as I go on how important it is to do that groundwork to isolate what the problem is, because if you don't do that work, you might not put in the right intervention. So one of the things that I'm really passionate about is using mediation when it's going to be useful. Okay, so I love mediation as an intervention, but particularly in workplaces, it's not the only intervention. And I know Joanne and my colleagues will share the same view that, there's so many other interventions that could be useful for people, such as conflict coaching. And we have some great people doing conflict coaching with employees, we've got, if it's really serious, we can't put them in a mediation, right? If they're allegations of sexual harassment, we don't want to put them in a mediation, right? So the intakes and assessments are so important in terms of how best are we going to support this moving forward. So this type of mediation, workplace mediation, is really unique. It has some really unique features that don't that don't need to be taken into consideration in a more business to business type of environment, right? Where it's just more transactional, or a family mediation, right? Because workplaces have resources and they can support their people through this journey. And this is one of the reasons I'm really passionate about working in workplaces, because we do have the capacity to really make a difference in putting in infrastructure to support people to learn new ways of managing conflict. And given so many of you are mediators, you would know how important that is. I know I'm an FTRP as well, but one of the reasons I really struggled with family mediation was there wasn't any resources to support the family to develop how they actually deal with difference and conflicts moving forward. So it's a really beautiful area and jurisdiction to work in, even though it is very complex here in Australia. So any questions so far? I hope it's relevant to you. Please just ask a question, just put it in the chat, and I would be happy to address that. Okay, so healthy complaints cultures. So where we sit, so the assumptions that we have when we're working with our companies is that it's okay to complain. We love complaints. Complaints are fine, right? As long as they're directed in the right way. That it's totally fine to complain. This is what I say to anyone that I'm working with. It's totally okay to complain. It's totally okay to disagree. It's totally fine. But what we tend to do is make a really big deal about it. And then does anyone here live in Brisbane? If you do, there is a bridge and it's got this big graffiti on it. And as you drive into the valley, which is near the city, there's a big tunnel, this kind of tunnel that you go under, and there's a graffiti there, and it says, the more I think about it, the bigger it gets. And so what we really want to do is provide people with the opportunity to address that and isolate for themselves, is this a problem that I want to let it go through the keeper, I can deal with this? Or is this serious enough for me to have a conversation with that person about? Or is it that serious I have to pull in a third party like HR, right? So a healthy complaints culture is like owning the issue, right? You've got the problem, and then being able to deal with that problem in a specific way. So at the moment here, if you're in Australia, you know that bullying has a lot of connotations, like, I don't want to work with that person's a bully, right? That's unhelpful in a healthy complaints culture, right? What is helpful is being specific. Yesterday when we were in the car and you said that joke, it made me feel really awkward and uncomfortable. And I'd really like to invite you to speak about that, because, it's something that I need to make sure doesn't occur again, for example. Okay, so being specific rather than general is a really healthy complaints culture that you want to, incorporate into your workplace culture. So you want to avoid all of those emotive trigger words like sexist and bully and, all of those sorts of words. The other thing is that we often engage in kind of directive comments, which are really unhelpful as well. So, for example, we might say, oh, that joke you said in the car while we were driving, it made me feel uncomfortable, and I don't want that to ever happen again. I need you to stop your behaviour. So that's what we're kind of trained to do. But all it does is get the other person's back up, right? Because imagine you're being funny and it's not really that funny, and someone says that. It can often leave a residue of like like a barrier that becomes a barrier, right? So what we want to do is use different words and different scaffolding to address that. So you might invite people to consider how they want to deal with that moving forward, right? So it's always a negotiation with that person, depending on what the issue is. Of course, if it was really bad, you need to deal with it in a more formal way. So being able to receive communications you disagree with is really, really, really important. And I can take you through a few steps if you're interested around how you can train people to do that, right? So the other thing we see all the time is that people don't listen to each other, okay? They don't listen to what's not said. They don't address the tone. They don't address the body language, right? And it's just almost like they're just sort of relying on their verbal communications, despite all these other communications sending different messages. So I'll give you an example of this. This is a recent one that we were involved with. One of the participants could not engage with that person non-verbally at all. So have you ever heard the saying like this, you're not listening with your body? Have you ever heard that kind of message? So you might be listening with your ears, but nobody knows you're listening because you're not engaged in the normal way that we would assess whether someone's listening to us or not. Eye contact, using your body, looking towards the person, even if you haven't got eye contact with them. Nodding, gestures that demonstrate that you're actively engaged in the conversation. So listening powerfully is not just about how someone says it and the words that they're using, but all those other little characteristics that demonstrate to us what's being heard and what isn't being heard. So a really healthy complaints culture is able to address all of those communications, not just the verbal ones, not just the emails, but all the communications that are giving messages. It's an authentic inquiry. So it's never telling anybody what to do, what they're doing wrong, but rather, this is where I'm at. What's your thoughts on that? So just a really authentic inquiry, not like a test. So often we see this is that they'll ask questions, but they know the answer and they're just kind of waiting for them to say the wrong thing. And then they'll say, they kind of trap them. So not just asking questions that align with their worldview, but genuine inquiries about, well, what is going on here and how do we move forward if we can move forward. Containing and de-escalating complaints. So you'll see in the toxic complaints culture, it's just sprayed everywhere. Complaints just got no structure around it. People are complaining about everything. Whereas in a healthy complaints culture, it's fairly contained. People are masterful at kind of de-escalating it. And they share responsibly. There is nothing wrong with talking to your colleagues about another colleague that you're having an issue with. So it's not about silencing people, but rather it's about sharing in a responsible way. So a lot of workplaces now in Australia, they have employee assistance programs, counsellors, they have access to HR so that people can sort of sort through all the noise and decide for themselves whether this is something they want to pursue or not. So that's a really healthy complaints culture, not silencing people, because often that's where people might go is like, oh, you can't talk about it. No, you can, but be responsible about it, because what you share has an impact on others and influences how others might behave and other people's relationships. So it's having a good consciousness of your influence over the rest of the team. So yeah, the Australian context, so with mediation, workplace mediation, it is regulated. We do have the Mediation Standards Board, and it's administered by the RMABs, one of which is Joanne's Mediation Institute, who's coordinating this event. So you do, a lot of HR people can conduct mediations, and they do, and there's not necessarily anything specifically wrong with that. But what I would encourage you to do, if you are in HR and you are called upon to do internal mediations, is to seek out getting some support around a model that you can use and you can understand. So a lot of people I've worked with in HR who haven't got a model and go and do this will often give me this feedback that it was was really helpful. They were kind of following that model anyway, but this has just given them some more structure. So it's important to have a model when you're going into mediation. For my businesses who are listening right now, it's really hard on HR individuals to ask them to go and do mediations when they don't have that model. So yeah, next. Any questions so far? I see a question there from Tamara. Hi, Tamara. How do you see the communication when working remotely? I'm assuming that means when you might be on a conversation like this, like you're on Zoom or you're in Microsoft Teams. Yeah, it's really interesting, that question. I'd like to talk about that some more. What specifically, Tamara, have you seen that's interesting that you'd like me to sort of talk some more about? I have some ideas about that, but I don't want to go off track. So where does Enverio fit in within the whole complaints landscape? So Enverio gets engaged by employers to help de-escalate and contain whatever issue they might be having, right? So an employer will ring us and say, hey, there's this problem. It's not serious enough to warrant a formal response. We would like you to try and work with these employees such that they can improve their relationship and be more productive, and, you know, it will impact their workplace culture in a positive way. So that's where we kind of sit, and and so if it does escalate, that's fine. It happens sometimes that it, needs to go to like the Fair Work Commission or Fair Work Ombudsman or Industrial Relations Commission or WorkCover or somebody, Workplace Health and Safety. Sometimes it needs to go there, but often employers will engage us to do exactly what I was talking about before around managing those workplace cultures, providing them access and a mechanism to be able to resolve it internally. And also, like I reckon probably 100% of the time, employers are asking us to support their people to develop some new ways of managing conflict. Okay, so it's not, we're not a public government, quasi-government organisation. We are a private organisation that employers use, but all of it, all of our mediators are accredited and are experts in this area, which Craig is one of. I just want to add that in. Okay, got that, Tamara. So what Tamara, if you haven't seen that chat, she's saying that just in general, she's seen it at uni and work life. It seems to be more subject focused, but it's also easy to miss the emotional component in messages text, in particular when you're working under time pressure. 100%. In fact, I think in my view, the online environment, people can be a little less aware because they don't get that feedback from people immediately, as you would if I was standing right in front of you, for example. I can't see any of you. You might be asleep for all I know. I don't know, but do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, you don't get that feedback, so you can't adjust your communication to suit what's going on for other people. So yeah, that's where we sit anyway. I'm just going to flick back to the slides, internal complaints, and where we sit. So these are the main issues that we see when workplaces come to us. So we cover a range of jurisdictions as well. We don't just do one. We don't just do government. We just don't do mining or engineering. We cover a whole range of jurisdictions, and we see the same kind of themes. It does not matter what jurisdiction, right? There are like peaks around certain industries, like education has their own little kind of themes, and health has its own kind of little themes. But overall and in general, the same themes seem to come up, doesn't matter where you work. So, these are just the main ones. So the lack of trust and confidence in competency. So yeah, that's a huge one. So where they have lost trust in the other person, then you'll find that they create what I call like a filter or a lens. And so it really doesn't matter what that person does. Once you're sort of in that space, it can be very difficult to shift that without some informal process like a mediation. So bullying is just, I'm not minimizing bullying, like it's very serious. The sorts of allegations that we hear that are appropriate for mediation are things like raised voice, tone, distribution of work, that kind of thing we can manage via mediation. There are some things that we can manage in mediation via where there are allegations of bullying. There are some things we won't. So, yeah, if you have any specific questions around that, you can certainly either email me or ask me. Tone is a big one. Tone and tude, which is short for attitude, I recently found out. So tone and attitude, so they're really huge. And the really tricky thing about tone is its perception and interpretation. So that can be a really challenging one, because you actually need to work with people to introduce new concepts and skills to help them deal with that. Okay, so that's the well, it is verbal, but they're not words. You know, it's like they are things that we have to talk about and manage, but it's more than just being able to deal with it via our communication and our words. There's a lot more going on that we need to address there. Undermining, so politics, agendas, that's quite big as well. Communication, short, blunt, that kind of complaint we get a lot. Crossing boundaries, so doing work that's not allocated to you, stepping over your role description, just different work ethics. That happens a lot. Like one person feels like they work really hard and the other person, but doesn't know how to sort of motivate the other person to work at the same pace as they're working in a productive way. So thank you, Judith. That's a really good question. So Judith's question is, how do you identify the line between conflict that can be addressed through workplace mediation and more serious situations where breaches of legislation being another approach or escalation needs to happen? So how we look at that, Judith, is that we look at the specific behaviour that's complained about. Now, if it's something like sexual harassment, depending on the seriousness of it, so for example, a bad joke, we could deal with in mediation, right? However, a snog at the Christmas party that was non-consensual, that's really serious. You cannot deal with that via mediation, okay? So it just depends on the nature. And there is a scale, whether people like it or not. There's a scale of bullying, there's a scale of sexual harassment. So what I do is when I'm working with a business and they say, you have to find out the nature of the allegations and what they've done so far, right? Some you would just straight out, no, I'm not mediating. And you will know that by conducting intakes. Okay, so you don't know until you actually speak with people one-on-one whether or not it's suitable for you to run that mediation. Okay, you have to do the intakes. So this is probably really obvious to everyone, but we would never engage in a mediation without speaking to everyone involved. And everyone includes the employer, because we want to make sure that what we're doing is consistent with what the employer also sees our role as. And if they're not aligned, we can address that and decide for ourselves whether it's something we want to be involved in. Okay, so so a breach, basically a breach of a policy or procedure that would warrant termination or disciplinary action, if it was substantiated, is serious. You don't want to be mediating that. So, for example, we did one and there was like 8 women, I think. 8 women, we interviewed them, went back to the board and said, we're not mediating. because they'd actually done an investigation. And in that investigation, they found that all of these women had been sexually harassed. That was the finding. So there is no way that we could keep them safe in a mediated process, right? They needed to take some stronger action, right? So we stepped out and said, we can't do it. So be aware too, if that's why it's so important to have a really good conversation with the employer about what they've already done, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't find that out. You wouldn't find that information out. So although they didn't like to hear that communication, ethically we couldn't proceed, right? We couldn't keep them safe in a one-on-one situation. So it was like, yeah, they needed to take some more formal action, and they did. This person ended up getting terminated. So, yeah, you do need to be very careful. That's why in our model, we interview everyone, not just the participants, but the employer is crucial to the ongoing success of that agreement. All right, so yeah, and do we want to go to the next slide? I'm going to leave this one out and go to the next slide, because we all know why mediation works, right? If you don't, feel free to give me a buzz or throw me a question. It's totally fine. Now, this is just for my internal HR business people who might go, well, how do I know when I'm supposed to mediate and when we should get someone else to mediate? Because you can mediate. It's totally fine for you to do that. Although I would say try and get a model for yourself so you can feel confident in the application of that. So the benefits of an external mediator is that we're not in the business. So if you have to maintain relationships with people, it's a good idea to get an external person, because you don't have to be the arbitrator, right? You can just apply the mediation agreement once it's been conducted by an external person. So that's why HR love us so much, because we come and we support them. They can maintain integrity in their relationships, and if anything happens, they can just blame us. So it's really good. So yeah, that's one way to sort of assess for yourself. The other thing that I would get you to look at is your skill set. Like, do you feel like comfortable? I've had plenty of HR sit in mediations with me to develop their skills. That's totally fine too. There could be a request from one of the parties. That would be the top 3 reasons why I would, if I was a business owner, why I would consider getting someone in externally. Okay, so I'm gonna, just because it's 10:40, I might get to our model and what we do. So, you know, it's a little bit different to the accredited model that we use, because the circumstances are very different. Often when we're working with people, they're walking off and they're sitting next to each other. They're in the same group. They have to attend a meeting with each other. So it's not like, as I said right at the beginning, a transactional kind of approach, right? We're really there to support them to set a good foundation or recalibrate their relationship and look at the things objectively around what doesn't work, and then introduce some new context, some new skills. Sometimes we model micro skills. We raise individual awareness of, you know, of how they're communicating. So I'll often give them both feedback around what I'm seeing. And it's always not like, oh, I'm the expert and this is happening. It's more like, okay, so I just noticed this. Is that what's happening here? Can you like unpack that for me a little bit? And so it's a really kind of negotiated approach to really unpacking all of those non-verbals, right? So so that's why it's not just the mediator in our process is not just an impartial arbiter of the participants' will. We really work intimately with them so that they can get the best out of the process to support them moving forward. But it really is designed to be something that is the beginning, right? Not the end. Often people who engage us, they'll just think, oh, we'll just do the mediation because it's just, I don't know, it's just getting out of hand and we just need some help. We can certainly assist to put in a structure, but really what's important is having an understanding of a process moving forward if it happens again. So we have no unreal expectations. We don't say to people, oh, you know, you'll attend this mediation, everything will be fine. In fact, we say it's likely that you're going to get in disagreements moving forward. That's probably going to happen. How are you going to deal with that? Right. So people, it's a really realistic approach to working with people. Are there any more questions so far? Yeah. So yeah, that's sort of the journey we've been on anyway. So it is a bit of a controversial process and way of working with people, because it's not based on that assumption that we are never, we don't have opinions, we don't have judgments, we don't have values, but we incorporate them in a way that's useful to the people we're working with and the businesses that we're working with. So we also include the businesses in the process, right? So it's not just the two people who are in conflict, but also what's happening with the business? What do they need? Do they know what to do when and if the mediation fails, right? Do they have a structure to put in place? If they come to them and complain again about the same things, what's going to be their approach to dealing with that? And I think that's one of the reasons we do really well, because we do cover off all of that. When I first started mediating in workplaces, maybe 10 years ago now, they, you know, I used to feel really responsible for their agreements, not only getting them, but what if they didn't work? You know, like it was totally unrealistic and silly, right? Very naive and just a really not a realistic approach to how mediation can support businesses, what it's good at, what its limitations are. So now it is just a much more holistic approach. And yeah, okay, I sort of went off on a tangent there, but you know, what am I talking about? And various models, yeah. Yes. So yeah, that happens frequently. So a conflict between the needs of the business and the needs of the individual and working through mediation. So yes, so yeah, that's really, really important. And one, it's looking at their culture and their appetite for doing things after the mediation, right? Post-mediation, because sometimes, you know, HR can't do anything either because they haven't got the support of their business around them to be able to implement more, you know, more cohesive, kind of a more cohesive approach. So, yeah, that's why it's important not to get your participants' hopes up as well. Like that might be it. That mediation might be it. That might be all they get. And I've literally had employers say that to me, like, this is it. That's all they get. If they don't reach agreement, they're both sacked. I have had employers say that to me. So we need to operate within the framework of what that employer is capable and willing to do. So yeah, and often they're not aligned, and then people have to really consider what they want to do under those circumstances. So for example, there might be a complaint, someone might make a complaint about someone else, it gets escalated because it's serious, it's not substantiated, and they still have to work together. So they might pull in someone like us to come in and address all of those underlying issues, but that might be all they get. Right, so it is important. So mediation will fail in one of three ways. Workplace mediations will fail in one of three ways. One, we do our intakes and we go, this isn't appropriate for mediation, okay? So that it fails at that point. The people do not get to the joint session. Or it will fail when you're in the joint session, the participants are unable to reach agreement. That's another way that the mediation will fail. Okay, so despite their best efforts, they're just unable to reach agreement, or one of them might say, you know what, I don't want to work with this person anymore. totally fine. So that's the second way that the mediation will fail. The third way, which was the point I was trying to make before, but I forgot, was that when they reach agreement, but they can't keep that agreement over time. So it's those structures you need to speak to your employer about, right? So partly if you're a mediator, partly that is so that they can really distinguish between if it does fail, they're prepared for it and you've prepared them for it, right? Instead of them ringing you maybe 3 weeks later and saying to you, hey, that mediation failed. No, the mediation didn't fail. They weren't able to administer their commitments over time, okay? So what was missing in that? Right. So it's always scaffolding the conversation so you can isolate the actual issue. Okay. Does that make sense, Judith? Okay. So that's why our model works, basically, is because we don't see ourselves as just negotiating to participants and trying really hard to kind of be independent around it. We are trying to introduce new concepts and skills and ways of dealing with conflict based on experience that we've had. All right, not as psychologists, not as lawyers, not like this is what you must do, but using the same micro skills as a mediator and sharing those and allowing those participants to choose which ones they like, which ones they want to trial, and then facilitating the process for that, right? And then measuring how they're going. And the measurement in workplace mediations is purely this, super simple, don't overcomplicate it. It's just, has their relationship improved? If it's improved, great, that's all you're looking for. Is it 100%? Probably not, and that would be normal. But have those moments that there have been conflict. Have they dealt with them better? Yes, perfect. That's it. That's all we're looking for, all right? So do you want to just flick through? I just noticed it's 10:49 and I do want to give people an opportunity to share with me anything that they got out of this session, and if they want to make any comments or have any questions. So I do have some top tools, but I don't want to go through them unless you really want me to, because I don't have enough time. So I would rather engage with you and you share with me a little bit about who you are and what you wanted to get out of today. And yeah, who's going to go first?
And
anything?
With a question that will get the ball rolling a little bit. A lot of mediations today are taking place online as opposed to in person. How do you find the difference between those two?
That's such an interesting question, and this is just speculation. And we do online mediations, but I think that if you are working with someone and it's in person, then the mediation format needs to be in person. If you are working with someone and it's all online, then that's fine, because we can adapt that format because that's the way they usually interact and communicate. But yeah, my view is that, yeah, if they have to sit next to each other after the mediation, then let's not do this online. Let's do this in person, because I think it's very different.
Thanks, Anna. That's great.
That's a great question, Jennifer, because we're going to do a mock intake after this. And the importance of the conversation with all parties. Here are some of the questions that I use that are my favourite. So you don't have to go to the mock intake after this. One, I always ask them this question. One, what has you stopped from resolving it directly with them? That's one of my top favorite questions. I don't ever do an intake without asking that question. And that gives you an insight into, why they haven't been able to address it. So that question will illuminate. They might even say, "Oh, I'm really worried about this person's reaction." Now that will open a whole range of new questions for you. So you might ask after that, have you tried and what happened? Okay, now that's a very illuminating question too, because they might say, oh no, I've never asked them. And then you might ask them, well, how did you draw that conclusion? Right? So all the time kind of testing for what they've already done, what worked, what hasn't worked, so that you can put your mind to, wonder what we could potentially try here and introduce in a way that's different to what they've already done. So that was my top question. What has you stopped from resolving this directly with the other person? What are the barriers that are in the way? What other questions? Just really structural questions, which kind of boring question that are probably in your intake checklist anyway, but things like, what do you want to get out of this process? That's another really important question, because you don't want anyone in the process who doesn't want to be there, right? One of the reasons we have such a high success rate is because we do that work. If they don't want to be there, they hate their job, and they just feel like they're being made to be there, then we probably wouldn't proceed. But most people don't. If you unpack a little bit, everyone just wants to go to work, do a good job, come home. So when you unpack it a little bit, it's usually like they just don't know whether it'll work. They're not sure if it will make it worse for them. And you get to address all of those questions. So all the same sort of questions that you would do, logistics, voluntary, what happens to the mediation agreement, I would just make sure you're really transparent. This agreement is going to your employer. Just be really transparent about your process. So there's some of the questions I would ask. Oh, for the employer. Sorry, I didn't read that properly. So specific questions I would ask the employer is what have they done? Where is it at? What do they want as an outcome of this process? That way you can manage any expectations as well, right? What are their expectations? And you can manage that as well, okay? Does that answer your question? Yeah, I could really talk a long time about a lot of aspects of workplace mediation. Has anyone else got anything pressing? Oh, sorry, Craig.
One of the things that really helped me when you were teaching me about mediation was how you can coach the participants in the intake call about how they handle themselves. Want to share a bit about that?
100%. So this is a skill that I call a conversation on the conversation. So I talk to the participants about how I want them to listen to the other person. I say exactly the same thing to both of them. And that is just you're setting a context of how you want them to hear the other person. So I always flag, you are going to disagree with each other. This process isn't about holding hands and singing Kumbaya, right? This process is about being able to hear what each other have to say, taking a step back from that, having a little bit of equanimity around what's just been said, and then letting that marinate in your mind and determine, well, what am I going to do with that, right? How are we going to move forward despite our disagreement, right? So always just like allowing them to process the information and then work out how best they want to deal with that. So I definitely stay away. I actually say this sometimes. I'm not Judge Judy. I'm not here to tell you who's right and who's wrong and whose argument is better than the other. My role really is to provide you with a safe space so you can explore that for yourself. Okay? You're welcome. So yeah, look, it's 10:55. So does anyone else have any questions? Great questions, by the way. All right, I think I'm done. But thank you very much for everyone who attended. I'm really hopeful that you got something out of this. And if you feel like you want to reach out, please do. As I said at the beginning, very open and transparent. Happy to answer any questions, talk you through anything that's going on for you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was a really great session. And we've learned a great deal about workplace mediation. And if anyone else has other questions, please send an email. We'd love to be able to help you with that. Thanks for attending today's session, everyone. We want to say a big thank you to our Mediator Network, Mediation Institute, our sponsors and collaborators and volunteers who have all contributed to make this week a success. So please do book on to some of the other events that are taking place. Just log on to the portal and register for your sessions. You'll find that you can find the link for that at mediatornetwork.mac.com, etc. Anyway, global debate is coming up soon. Make sure you log on to the global debate, which is being chaired by Jonathan Lux. This will be an interesting discussion on whether the Western model of mediation is fit for a multicultural society. We'll be joined by representatives from all over the world. Awareness Week are all entitled to join, £9 during November. So thanks very much for being with us today. We'll close the mediation presentation now and encourage you to log on to some of the other events that are happening all through this week. All the best. Thanks, everybody.